I'm Judy Murray. Behind every champion is a driving force.
Victoria at her best.
Wanting to prove people wrong was something that was a very powerful driving force in me.
We all got prepared for how to perform, but no one prepared us for what will happen after.
The best of British.
If you can see it, you can believe it, and you can believe that that could be you.
We knew that we was a part of something bigger.
More glory for Sarah Storey.
If you don't stop doing this, you may go deaf.
It was everybody else that almost had to suffer because of what I did.
Stunning stuff from Anderson.
Becky, I think you need a sports psychologist. And I was like, why? What's wrong with me?
I was a little bit scared when he first told us. I knew that there was a massive responsibility.
The undisputed lightweight champion of the world. It's going to be her historic second goal. Kelly Hall's for Great Britain.
I didn't know about a breakdown, becoming a self-harmer, to being depressed. Had no idea what that meant.
If you tell me I can't do something, I will go out of my way to prove you wrong.
Representing Great Britain, Sarah Storey. 5 gold medals in the swimming pool. The most successful British female Paralympian of all time.
Sarah Storey, she's won the gold medal.
Well, she is arguably our most successful Paralympian, male or female. I think it fundamentally changed the way we view disability and impairment. We're lucky to have Sarah around at the right time. I mean, she really did galvanise so much support.
A piece of British sporting history.
She's an amazing cyclist, an amazing athlete, mum, and she doesn't look for sympathy.
She is world class with her times.
She's got the physiological profile, she's got the mental attitude to be in the Olympics. She's certainly unstoppable.
She's constantly driving, constantly trying to be the best. I think that kind of relentless drive she's got is one of the reasons she's here and still competing, you know, all those years after she first started at the Games in Barcelona.
More glory for Sarah Storey.
Beyond any reasonable doubt that she is the outstanding sportswoman and sportsperson of her generation. When people say it's impossible, Sarah makes it possible.
Sarah Storey, what a story.
Welcome to the driving force, Sarah Storey, 14 times Paralympic champion, the most decorated Paralympian of all time in Great Britain across 2 sports. It's been an incredible journey. Tell me where it all started.
I'm the eldest of 3 children. When I was born, they noticed that I was born without my left hand. I had a completely normal childhood. My grandma had worked in disability services, and she had worked with some profoundly disabled people, so she's like, oh, this is nothing. She'll be fine. You'll never notice after a few weeks. So, yeah, I had an outdoor life. We were very fortunate to have a big back garden at home. So learning to throw and catch from being able to stand up, kick a ball. We'd go camping, and yeah, Mum and Dad were scout leaders as well, so they'd take me to cub camp, and I was a cub from being about 2 years old, with my cousins looking after me.
So swimming was the first sport that you excelled in. Where did you get into swimming?
So my primary school had a school swimming club. Really quite unusual, I suppose, now. So as soon as I started primary school, I mean, I'd swim with my parents, but I learnt to swim in that first half term of reception class. So I was 4 years old, got my 10-metre badge, and then the school swimming club was just kind of like the constant every Saturday afternoon, and I rapidly moved through the swimming groups that there were, and by the time I was probably 6, I was in the hour group, where you did a full hour on a Saturday afternoon. I did my 3,000-metre badge when I was 6 years old. I did the school swimming galas that we had, just competing against each other and then occasionally against local schools. And when I was 8 years old, I was fastest swimmer in the school. So I spent 3 years with the trophy. The whole school swam together on a Saturday afternoon, and the parents sort of helped to facilitate that. And the coach was one of the mums of the lads I was at school with.
I love that it was a female coach. What difference does that make, do you think? You know, having more female teachers, female sports coaches?
Well, I think the primary school was very female-dominated. We had a headmaster, Chris Parker, who was really sports-orientated, and we had gymnastics club, we had a table tennis team that played in an adult league. I was part of that as well. We played netball, we did all the local leagues and all the different sports. But the swimming club was something that the parents kind of had control over and led with. So my mum was on poolside as the medical person. She was a nurse, and Lynn Ashton was the sort of head coach, if you like. And she had 2 boys, but she used to take us to life-saving competitions as well as doing all the competitive swimming things. And she was a real stickler for technique, which was absolutely brilliant. And we'd all learn how to do synchronised swimming because she loved synchronised swimming. And she really knew her stuff about synchro and how the importance of learning how to scull was the basis of all the swimming strokes. And I think she had so much success with us because she took us through those, basic skills for synchro and then adapted them into the swimming strokes as well.
I love what you said there about the life-saving, because for me, swimming should be something that every child has the chance to do, because it's a life skill, it's not just a sport.
That's absolutely right, and that's ultimately why the school swimming club started. So there was a real tragedy in our village where one of the school kids, he drowned in the local canal. And so off the back of that tragedy, they set up the school swimming club to make sure that that never happened to another pupil from the school. And so his trophy, the Carl Bailey Cup, became the trophy that was for the fastest swimmer in the school. And I was Sarah Bailey, I was no relation to him, but his trophy was sat on our mantelpiece for 3 consecutive years. And that was the legacy of that tragedy, that every child in our school could swim before they left primary school.
At what point did you start to compete on a regional or national level?
So when I was 10 years old, Lynn took me down to Stockport Metro Swimming Club, and at the time they said I was too old to start formal training. But they didn't know me and the fact that I was doing every other sport possible. I was a fit child, even though I hadn't swum every day. I'd only sort of swum twice a week, perhaps. So at that point, I started to compete in the local area, and I very rapidly moved up through the groups to catch up with my peers. And at that point, we didn't know the Paralympic Games existed. I was just an able-bodied sport, just doing the same as any other child. And it was probably when I got to being 12 years old and I'd caught my peers up in terms of the local swimming club, that I realised that having one hand was a little bit of a disadvantage, and I was not quite as quick as I wanted to be. And the frustration of just missing out on national age group qualifying times sort of started to set in.
When you got into Paralympic swimming, who opened the door for you to that?
I watched a TV news programme, I think it was, about a lady who was trying to make the Games in Barcelona, which was going to be 2 years later, and she'd just come back from the World Championships, and I saw that she had some of her arm missing. And my coach at the time was a Deaflympian, Alistair Johnson. He'd been to the Deaflympics and then he'd moved into coaching. And I said to him, do you know anything about people who compete who have something missing? I didn't know how the terminology. I'd grown up in the neighbourhood.
How to call it?
Yeah. And he said, well, I didn't want to kind of offer it to you because you were getting on so well. I didn't know if you'd consider yourself disabled or not. He said, but there's a classification system, and we can find out about if there's people who have a similar arm to you, who you could compete against alongside the stuff that you're doing with our swimming club. And he sent me the name and address of a lady who was running the Northwest Disability Swim Squad. And I wrote a letter to her with all my personal best times. And then every time I did another personal best at the local gala, I'd write to her again. And 18 months later, she wrote back to me to tell me when the regional competition was to select people for national championships. So I was glad I was persistent because it took a while. And of course, in the days before email and text messages, there was no phone number to ring. And she invited me to this gala. I went there and I kind of wiped the floor with everybody. Unfortunately for me, there was a lady there who was involved in the higher up level of British parasport, and she said to me, no, you need to go down this route now, and she sent me to a training weekend for amputees and les autres. So all of the people with amputations or with les autres who were not classified as a cerebral palsy athlete, a blind athlete or a wheelchair athlete would go to this one place in Foxhollies in Birmingham. So I went to this training weekend and started in lane 1 with the slowest swimmers and finished in lane 6 with the fastest swimmers. And they were like, where have you come from? We were about 10 months out from the Barcelona Paralympics by this point. And by the end of the training weekend, I'd been selected for the British swim team, and that's sort of nearly 28 years ago now.
Why was it so difficult to find out about these things? Was there just not much going on?
You know, there was very little publicity about the Paralympic Games. Seoul Paralympics was sort of marked as the first of the modern era in some senses because it was the first Games for a number of games where it had been held immediately after the Olympic Games. I think there was a lack of understanding, there was very little funding, so we didn't have UK sport and lottery funding back then. And also because it was arranged according to disability, so it was focused more on what was the impairment of somebody rather than their sporting accolades or their sporting capability. And it was probably just after the Games of '92 where they started to rearrange the way that they did things. So it then became pan-disability in each sport. So swimming had its own setup for all types of disability. And those organisations that focused on the disability aspect moved sort of down a level on the ladder and started to work at even more grassroots to try and bring athletes in or potential athletes in, teach them the basics, give them the skills and the confidence to then move up the ladder and into kind of the national team setups.
So everything was just starting to come together in terms of Paralympic sport, and I can't believe you were just 10 months from the Barcelona Olympics, where you ultimately went on to be incredibly successful. But talk me through those 10 months. What happened in that period?
I went back to school, really, and just kept training. There was very few opportunities to be in a 50-metre pool, and we knew the Barcelona Games was going to be 50 metres and outdoors, and I was a backstroke swimmer, so when you used to follow in the roof of the swimming pool to stay straight, you have to think about the other ways that you're going to be able to stay straight in the lane, because the lanes are about 2 metres wide, so if you go wobbly, then you're going to go a lot further than the 100 metres of the actual event. So we were looking for competitions to try and give me that experience. We were just sort of building up, trying to stay fit and healthy, and ultimately trying to talk my school around, I was trying to talk my PE teachers into letting me do sports day, because when I got selected for the Games in the May of 1992, then that was the whole summer of sport at school coming up. And they wanted me to kind of ditch all the sport at school just to focus on swimming. So I remember my PE teachers sitting me down and going, "We don't want you to get injured." And sometimes, especially at St Peter's Gate, I was in the building completely by myself because the whole thing just shut down in August. So I had to be really self-motivated, and I think that's probably where I learned most about the idea of, you know, training by myself and that intrinsic motivation that you need.
So your coach basically set the programme, booked the pools, you had to get on with it on your own, along with your mum and dad, who obviously have to take you everywhere. How big an influence have they been on your career?
They provided me with the opportunity to lead where I wanted to go, so they'd never forced me to do anything. It always had to be because I wanted to do it, and I had to lead them into it. So when it came to morning training, for example, it was me that needed to set the alarm and wake them up. And of course, with swimmers, we train before school, we train after school, so it's a huge amount of commitment from everybody, and they wanted to make sure it was my motivation, not theirs.
You were very young when you went to the Olympics in Barcelona. 14 years old. How did you fit in with what I imagined would be a very much older squad of people?
It was interesting because our relay team, we had Bev Gull, who was 39, and then we had 3 teenagers. So we used to call ourselves Mum and the Girls, and that was kind of our nickname. We won 2 silver medals as a quartet. There was a group of us there, and it was great because we had like the mentorship of the older swimmers and the older athletes, because obviously all the sports were there, but we also had this almost like youth club feel because we could hang out together like teenagers do and enjoy, you know, the village in the way that you can, but also we had the older ones keeping us on the straight and narrow.
What led you to go with backstroke?
So I think backstroke was probably the one stroke within the individual medley that I enjoyed the most. But I was an individual medley swimmer who did butterfly under duress, caught up on backstroke, and then was able to hold my own on breaststroke and front crawl. One of the things that I think has probably been a constant throughout my career is that I've never been able to do just one thing. I really enjoy that variety.
What did it feel like lining up to dive in for your very first race there?
It was the 400-metre freestyle, and I was up against a German swimmer called Claudia Hengst, who'd never been beaten. She'd won everything, she held every world record, and she was this nemesis of everybody in my category. And she had this kind of demeanour in the call room where she would just constantly be smiling and she'd be strutting around, and everybody was just floored by this. And all the older swimmers were saying, you're going to have to get on top of the psychology of this girl because she beats people before they've even left the call room. And she beat me in that very first race. She broke her own world record, but I did the most enormous personal best time. And I was like, God, I'm in really great shape. You know, I'd not had anyone to compare myself to because I'd been training by myself. And my parents had always said to me, focus on your own personal best times because you can't control what anyone else is doing. And that's probably been the advice I've followed every day for my whole career in sport, because unless you better yourself, that's the only thing you really have control over. No one had ever met me before outside of Great Britain.
So nowadays, Olympic and Paralympic athletes have access to great facilities, big sports science and sports medicine networks. But what was it like in 1992? What was in place for you?
There was no centralised system. I think that started to come on board after the Games in '96 when the lottery funding started and then the English Institute of Sport. But there was a lot of local support, and Sports Aid Foundation, or Sports Aid as it's called now, would provide grants to athletes to help them with their living and training costs.
I first met Sarah Storey back in the early 90s when Manchester were bidding to bring the 2000 Olympics to Britain, and I was then chair of the Sports Aid charity, which helps young achievers to achieve their potential. Sarah was already a serial winner in her then discipline of swimming, and I saw her as one of the potential athletes of the Northwest that I felt should ambassadorily approach and attract, supporting, I think, resources for not only herself, but for other athletes. And I remember first meeting her as a stroppy teenager, I think I'd sum her up, but she already had such a clear vision of what she wanted to achieve, and more importantly, how she was going to achieve it. Had a wonderful family supporting her.
I remember my dad had a kind of like a trust fund set up where we would apply to the trust fund with the grant money it kept in trust, so it was used for the right things. No prize money and very little coverage. So when you got in the local newspaper, as I did coming home from Barcelona, I had Blue Peter camera crew following me around in Barcelona for a little while during the Games. You know, that was kind of the big time.
And did you enjoy that little bit of fame?
I'd watched Blue Peter religiously as a child, so I'd written to them and said, I think you should, you know, focus on the Paralympics and show what's possible to young children who have a disability and maybe want to know a little bit more about sport. And they loved the idea, so they came along and they videoed me for 3 or 4 days, and then afterwards, when I got home from those Games, I went into the studio alongside Tanni Gray-Thompson, Chris Holmes, and lots of different other athletes. They had a table tennis. They'd even built a pretend athletics track in the studio.
Wow.
So yeah, it was good, and it just gave us that opportunity to publicise the Paralympics, because I suppose it was the start of what we've seen grow in terms of public perception over the last, 28 years.
You were really badly bullied at school, and who did you find to share that with?
So when I first came home from the Games in '92, my school said to me, what you need to do is come in with your medals. Once you've done Blue Peter, come back to school. We'll draw a line under it. We'll get on with your GCSEs. And I had a bit of a problem with my year group or my classmates who thought, because I wasn't talking about it, I thought I was too good to talk about it. But it's funny because if I'd have constantly been talking about how good it was at the Games, and then I would have had equally as, I would have been called a big head anyway. So it was a bit tricky because I was this walking conversation stopper at school, and I remember I would be in the girls' toilet and I'd be in a cubicle and they'd come in and be talking about me. Who does she think she is? She comes to school with wet hair, and, she never talks about what she's doing, and she's never available at weekends, and she's always rushing off after school, or she's gone running at lunchtime. And what would generally happen was in the morning, we'd all have our set desks within the form room to have registration, but they'd move themselves around so that I was kind of isolated, surrounded by the guys. And so then I would, talk to them, and then they were like, oh, look at you trying to get a boyfriend, or, you know, just like nitpicky stuff. But of course, it was difficult because they wanted to go to the cinema, they were doing sleepovers, and I had this sort of parallel life in sport. So I told my parents about the challenges I was having, and we tried to be as pragmatic as we could, because you can't control somebody else's behaviour, and if they don't like you, they don't like you. You're not going to be able to change that a great deal. And because one of the sort of instigators of it was someone who'd been quite close to me, I knew her really well, but she didn't like where my career was going. It wasn't where her career was going. Maybe that was the jealousy side. So I would go to the library at break time to get work done. I would obviously go out at lunchtime. And then I'd leave school and I'd try and kind of avoid the situation where I was one-on-one with any of them, or not, you know, me against a few, as it were. And it was just a lonely existence at school. But I think because I had this other life where my swimming friends were and my swimming career was, and the aspirations I had there, it was worth it to suck it up, and because I knew my career in sport would last a lot longer than bullying at school.
Do you think there was a lot of jealousy over what you'd achieved? You've come back with your medal haul, you're on Blue Peter, you're in the local paper. Does that play a factor? That's a difficult age, 14.
I think there was an element of not understanding. And also, I'd grown up hugely at those games. I'd had 3 weeks in the Olympic Village with older people. I'd learnt the importance of, you know, that regiment of race day. Going through those processes as an athlete is completely different to being sat in a classroom and learning and rubbing shoulders and having to do interviews, having to think on your feet in front of a camera. And although it wasn't the same sort of coverage as we would enjoy now at the Paralympic Games, it was very much, you know, different to being a schoolgirl. It probably built a thicker skin on me that has helped in sport as well. If your competitors don't like you, or you come across a setup in coaching that, you know, you don't get on with, you need to be able to kind of like not react, retaliate all of the time. And so that emotional side of things, you have to be able to regulate, and I definitely learned to regulate the emotional side of it at school.
But did that at any point cause you any problems?
I used to take my own lunch, or I used to go and buy my lunch in the local village, because after a certain age you were allowed to leave school at lunchtime and come back. But I'd stopped eating, really. I went out at lunchtime just for a walk. I didn't go and buy any food. I would have an apple or something, and I'd come back to school, and then I'd pick my way through my dinner after school. And I lost a lot of weight in that first term and a half at school. And it probably wasn't until the following February, when I went to the National Junior Swimming Championships, that one of the other parents who was looking after their son or daughter on poolside said to my dad, "Has Sarah been ill over Christmas?" I was painfully thin, and it wasn't a great situation because I didn't really want to eat during the day at school. I was kind of like eating by myself, but I didn't really feel hungry. It was just probably the only thing I could control during the day was the food intake. I couldn't control the behaviour of the other kids, so I could only control the eating. And it was probably another few weeks later that I wasn't gaining weight, I was still too skinny.
Two things I've recognised happen in sport. One is you get mental illness, which we'll get the depressions, obsessional compulsive disorders. But the second thing is I've recognised that the girls try and cope with this, but it becomes a very dysfunctional coping strategy. So we get a lot of self-harm with cutting, starving themselves, or even overeating, and it's dysfunctional coping strategies which present them with their own problems. And that just escalates this feeling that this young person is out of control. And unfortunately, I have met in elite sport a lot of condemnation of this instead of empathy and understanding and actually helping them.
My mum said to me, we really need to go and see the GP now, because it's important that we make sure that you're healthy. And the GP took one look at me and said, "You could do with a jam sandwich." And she said, "OK, Sarah, I understand that you're having a tough time, but if you don't eat, then you'll not be able to compete in any sport." And she said, "What I need you to do is I need you to do me a food diary, and I need to see that you're eating healthily enough to be an athlete, because it's really important to me that we don't lose you." And she said, "If I don't put you through this process and I send you down the hospital route, you'll forever be in a system that's trying to support you for having an eating disorder. And I think your eating is disordered. It's not an eating disorder yet. So if we can get on top of this now, then that will save you a lot of appointments and a lot of other things that you need to go through for us to help make you well." And to be honest, I didn't like not eating. I didn't like this kind of tussle I was having. And so doing the food diary was a really good way for me to kind of justify to me that I was eating okay, I was still in control of something. That was me kind of correcting something to make my career better. And when it was framed in that way, it was a lot easier to handle. And I think it's something I've passed on as I've got older and I've met other athletes who've struggled with their eating. I've framed it in a way, let's eat for your sport, let's eat to fuel you to be a good athlete, and then that gives them a different focus and a different type of control.
It's so important that people can package things up for all of us in a way that means something to us.
It's hugely important, and I think recognising that it's a control thing. So many people with eating disorders talk about having no control over something else, but this was the thing I could control. And so being able to control it in a positive way rather than a negative way was really, really vital to helping me kind of almost snap out of it, if you like. When you feel like you're labelled as something, then you behave more in that way. Nobody wants to behave badly. You just want to feel included and feel, feel settled.
You got yourself through your eating disorder. You did your GCSEs at school, chose to do your A-levels away from school, and then you went to university to study sports science. You ended up having to coach yourself in swimming. Why was that?
So I'd chosen my university town because it had a fantastic swimming club. But unfortunately, when I got there, the coach had decided he didn't coach disabled athletes. There was no talking this coach round. He wanted me in a squad with what were effectively the kids that didn't really want to be there. We trained at stupid hours of the day and night. And I was generally going to bed by 9 o'clock because you're getting up for a 5:15 a.m. session. So I ended up talking to the swimming pool and negotiating some additional swimming time for myself in a lane during the public sessions that fitted around my university studies. So coaching myself was the only way, really, to get enough hours in, because otherwise I just wasn't going to be able to continue at the level that I was.
Were there any adverse effects to coaching yourself?
I think the biggest challenge coaching myself was knowing how to plan the cycles of training. I just did too much. And at one point, I started to go and live back at home with my parents, because the house I was living in Leeds, there was 5 people in that house that really enjoyed partying, but I needed to be able to obviously get up for morning training. So what I found myself doing was living back at home, commuting over to Leeds, and the constant driving. I just had far too much time in the car, and I was just really, really struggling to get enough rest in. And so as a result, I started to get fatigue, and I ignored it. I thought that I was just swimming badly, so I did even more training. And I didn't have anyone there to regulate me. And as a result, I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome at the end of 1998.
What effect did that chronic fatigue syndrome have on the next stage of your career?
It was a point where I couldn't even walk up a flight of stairs. I couldn't go in a lift either because it was sending my inner ear funny. And that's completely unrelated to ear infection. It was just because I was so tired. I couldn't warm up, I couldn't swim down. I literally raced and that was it. So when I got home, I went to the British Olympic Medical Centre at Northwick Park, and they gave me 6 weeks complete rest, and I had to gradually build up my training so that I could also kind of prepare for those games in Sydney. But alongside that, the guy that was in charge of the swim team at the time said, well, you're obviously not good enough anymore. He'd written me off as a swimmer, didn't select me for the pre-Paralympic event in 1999. There was a test event out in Sydney as part of the Southern Cross Games, and they took their best swimmers to that event. And as a defending Paralympic champion, it would have been a passage of right, really, to be there. Mm-hmm. But I was the one person they left out that probably should have gone as well. He said I was making it up. There was nothing wrong with me. I just needed to get over the fact that I was 21 now, probably coming towards the end of my swimming career. I wasn't best pleased to hear that, as you can probably imagine. I wanted to prove him wrong.
And you did prove him wrong.
So in Sydney, I did a toned-down version of my programme. I did 4 events instead of 8. And then we prepared for the Commonwealth Games. And at the end of 2002, 3 months after the Commonwealth Games, I won 3 world titles at the World Championships in Argentina and kind of announced myself back as the driving force I'd been as a swimmer prior to that chronic fatigue syndrome.
So another medal haul. How did that success set you up for the Games in 2004?
I was one of the favourites for a couple of different events in the pool, but unfortunately in the run-up to the Games I was, slightly derailed mentally, I suppose, because my mum was diagnosed with breast cancer in the July, and she was able to have a surgery to have a mastectomy, but she delayed having chemotherapy so she could still come to the Games, and she talks about that, how she specifically said to the surgeon, "I need to go and watch this Games." But completely unrelated to that, I somehow managed to pick up the village flu in Athens. It was a form of fatigue, so for me it was a bit scary because I'm thinking I'm going backwards to the way I'd had it as a chronic fatigue syndrome. But it was just a viral thing that made me feel really tired all of the time. And so I did compete and I won 3 medals. They weren't the gold medals that we thought I was capable of, and I definitely kind of felt like I'd underperformed at that particular event.
What happened to lead you to change from swimming to cycling?
So after every Paralympic Games, I used to go and do something a little bit different just to kind of keep things fresh. So sometimes it was running, sometimes it was kayaking. And after the Games in Athens, I went down to the Manchester Velodrome to learn how to ride on the track. A track bike, completely different to the road bike I'd commuted to college on. It was, no brakes, a fixed gear, and you're going around in circles turning left all the time. I went back to Australia in the winter of 2004-05 to get back into swimming. But unfortunately, when I came home from Australia, I'd picked up an ear infection from one of the pools I'd been training in, and it just went from one ear to the other ear, and I think I'd recover, and then it would appear in the next ear. And in the time that I wasn't allowed to swim, I went onto a bike, went back to the track, and it was during that process that British Cycling spotted me riding round. Big, broad shoulders. I had an extra 12 centimetres on my shoulders back then. And so, what are you doing at the velodrome? Why aren't you in a swimming pool? So I'd explained the process, and they gave me a little bit of coaching, and I was eventually offered a trial in the summer of 2005 to see how fast I would be over 12 laps. I also met my now husband, Barney. So he and I first met as teammates at a pre-Paralympic training camp.
I first met Sarah I think it was in Cyprus actually, yeah, we were effectively on a multi-sport training camp in preparation for the Games in Athens. And we were obviously at the same hotel as part of British Paralympic Association team. And yeah, we just first got chatting there, and that was kind of first chat really.
Barney piloted the visually impaired tandem, the sprint tandem in the kilometre and the sprint events at the Paralympics in 2004. And the cycling team had an apartment upstairs from where I was with the swim team, so I kept crossing paths with him. But it wasn't until I was down at the velodrome on a regular basis and he was diverting his training rides to come and say hello that I saw more and more of him. I was loaned a bike by them to train on the road, and he helped me look after that. We moved in together fairly quickly. We just got on really well. I just thought it was a bit of fun. It was something we could do together at the weekends. I could go out training with him. And it all kind of escalated quite quickly because I had this persistent ear infection, and I was determined it wasn't going to beat me, but even getting special earplugs, strapping my head up like a rugby player, I'd still got water in my ears. So eventually the doctor said to me, if you don't stop doing this, you may go deaf. Your ears are not functioning the way they should, and that they really are in a bad way. And so it was at that point I said, OK, I won't swim now. When can I swim? I'm not going to tell you until I see your ears functioning well, he said. So I was then faced with this indefinite amount of time out the pool, so getting on a bike to race seemed like a really good use of my time.
Suddenly, you discover that you are not able to swim for quite a significant period of time. So how do you deal with that?
Well, at the time, I was on my bike, kind of trying to stay fit, focusing on what I could control, because that was kind of a theme throughout my career. And British Cycling would sort of chat to me. I was with Barney at that point, so he was inside the squad. He told them, and they said, well, should we trial her over 3,000 metres, see where she's at in terms of if she's going to be any good on a bike? And it was before they'd talked about talent transfer, so the idea of someone switching sports hadn't really been invented, as it were. But that trial saw me just a second outside of the world record. So they selected me for the European Championships, which was 3 weeks later. I spent that 3 weeks studying the Tour de France, just learning everything I possibly could, questioning Barney.
You were cramming.
Yes, I was. I was like this, just suddenly trying to work out everything. And at the Europeans, I won the individual pursuit. I did break the world record then. And I went outside and won the road race.
When we look at an athlete who transfers from one sport to another, the question I would ask is, assuming they've got the physical ability and the skill to do it, and some sports may not be able to, what are the mental skills that they're transferring across? What is it that makes a champion mentally? And you look at emotional skills, and from my perspective, I'm biased towards this, is I believe if you can learn to understand your mind and manage your emotions and your thinking and your behaviours, that's my triad, then the chances are you can transfer that to anything at all.
Being able to have that competitive outlet while I wasn't allowed to swim was just, yeah, I was very grateful for it.
She's constantly driving, constantly trying to be the best, person she can be, in all kind of forms of life. So I think that kind of relentless drive she's got is one of the reasons she's here and still competing, all those years after she first started at the Games in Barcelona.
Were you surprised how quickly you became successful in another sport?
I was hugely surprised. It wasn't something I expected. I made the conscious decision to enjoy being a nobody, because that meant you could do things much quicker, because nobody knew who you were. There was no one to talk to. You could just sit back and watch it all take place around you. And as far as I was concerned, I was very fortunate to go to the Europeans alongside my then new boyfriend, who was, one of the champions of the world. He was, at the very, very top in tandem. And I had a ringside seat watching him compete. The competitive edge in me wanted to join him, I suppose, at the top of that podium. And to be able to do that on the first occasion was quite mind-blowing to me, because there were so many things I did wrong in that race. Even immediately, I'd happily have done the race straight away again if I could have done.
It must be absolutely brilliant to have somebody at your side who completely understands what it is that you're trying to do, somebody to talk to. Because not everybody gets it. Not everybody has that kind of mindset or understands the sacrifice and the dedication and the commitment that's required and how it can change your life.
Yeah, I think having that other half who was going through exactly the same as I was in a different event, obviously, and a team event as well, being on the tandem, but knowing that the processes and the reasons and the psychological challenges as well as the physiological challenges was just so important. And I think also when I was having to make that decision, do I carry on cycling or do I completely just go back into swimming and ignore the fact I've just had this, sudden success on a bike? He was able to explain to me what being a cyclist might look like and help me to make that decision.
The main limitation is being able to learn as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and absorb as much information as you can quickly. And having me on hand to kind of answer all questions, and if I didn't know the answer, try and find out for her as well. It definitely kind of speeded up that process to make a switch from swimming to cycling a lot quicker.
So when Sarah made that announcement intention, a lot of people were doubting it, but anyone who doubts Sarah's story does so at their peril.
In Beijing in 2008, you as husband and wife win gold medals on the same day. What are the chances of that?
Yeah, it was quite unbelievable. Beijing, I was racing my very first event with a chance of a gold medal on day 4 of the track. So I'd watched him win gold in the kilo on the first of his 2 events. And then I got my chance on day 4, like I say, and it was just amazing to be a part of the whole event. I mean, the Olympic team had just gone and won everything. So the Paralympic team was set up for the most amazing games. I think collectively we won 17 gold medals, and there was the smallest team we've ever taken. But when Barney and I won gold on the same day, I mean, he'll probably tell the story differently to me, but I remember I went up to race and he was between sprint matches and he was told to sort of sit down because he was getting so excited. and I didn't realise I'd won until like this final metre of my opponent racing. And I'm in track centre kind of shaking because I was a world record holder, I'd broken the world record, my time would have been 7th at the Olympics. And suddenly there was this chance that because of the factor system they were using, because they were racing us against a different disability group, and it was a little bit complicated, that there was a chance that it wasn't going to be the gold medal we'd kind of been aiming for. But it all turned out all right in the end, in 23 and hundredths, and I was just like in tears. I just couldn't believe that I'd got this very first gold medal as a cyclist.
So from 2008, just tell me about the medal haul, the major successes that have led us up to where we are today in 2020.
So after 2008, I had the opportunity of a full 4-year cycle to try and improve myself as an athlete. And one of the things we decided to do, because Barney was so instrumental in helping me to kind of plan my route forward alongside Gary Brickley, my cycling coach, who had started to work with me as soon as I came in from swimming.
At first, I think she was quite happy using a basic bike to get going, just to get herself used to getting out for long periods on the bike. And gradually, she was keen to learn more about cycling, learn about how to measure power, how she could respond to training, how she could adapt herself to get faster. So there was a massive steep learning curve and performance curve in her early days, and suddenly she's beaten record after record after record, leading on to beating world records.
We decided that if I wanted to be better, I needed to go out and race in the professional peloton on the road and challenge myself technically in road racing against women who were trying to make it into the Olympics. So I started to do my first professional races in 2010, and I got selected for the Commonwealth Games team in that year as well. And in 2011, I raced in the team pursuit team that helped to qualify the women that went on to win that very first team pursuit gold medal in 2012.
She's got the physiological profile, she's got the mental attitude to be in the Olympics.
I know Sarah's struggles to gain selection, the barriers and the hurdles, the obstacles that are put in her way, even with her achieving all that she's achieved.
She has raced at the Commonwealth Games in India. She has been in the World Cups for Great Britain cycling. She should have been selected for the Olympics and in the team pursuit. She has all the attributes to do that.
But 2012 was the home games, and I was going into that event as a world champion in 4 different events, with 4 different events to compete at in London. And when we came out of that games with those 4 gold medals that we'd gone in looking for, it was just a completely different life. Everybody had watched the games in London, parasport had really come of age, we'd had wall-to-wall coverage, and that really set up a completely different type of career beyond that.
I will say this, I think the Olympic Games in 2012 were fantastic, but I think if you speak to most people, the surprise element of that year was the Paralympic Games.
It was incredible pride. I mean, it was. You sat there and you looked at what was going on, and then you saw a country get its mojo back.
I think it fundamentally changed the way we view disability and impairment, certainly in society, and probably even more so in the workplace. And I see our Paralympians, and Sarah Storey was absolutely at the forefront of that, as being trailblazers.
That really brought athletes with disabilities to the fore, and it showed what amazing athletes that they were, and that we became very integrated.
The one moment that really stands out with Sarah was obviously 2012, those magical games. And I have to say that's my standout moment of saying she always delivers. She's always unlikely to not deliver, and she'll do so when you least expect it, even when you expect her to deliver. She does something different, and that's what makes her so extraordinarily unique.
I had Louisa in 2013, I came back to racing in 2014. I broke the world record for the first time when she was 9 months old, and suddenly realised that although I'd done everything I'd ever wanted to as an athlete, I still had the opportunity to try and become even better.
When women have babies, their levels of hormones will change and their outlook will change, because nature is starting to give them hormones and transmitters in the brain that previously weren't that active. So it will affect the way that they see life, their children, their career, their sport. If coaches can be tolerant to that, and the public can be tolerant, then there's no reason why people can't gather themselves and retune if they want to come back to elite sport and perform just as high as they did previously.
The only key difference working with Sarah is that she's gone through 2 pregnancies and she's had to recover from that period, and she's come back stronger. And that happens to some endurance athletes, that they do come back stronger. Some people decide to give up. Some people carry slight injuries on their hips, or they get muscle tears and they decide that's not for them. But with Sarah, she's always bounced back straight after any pregnancy.
There's so many sportswomen that have been told not to have babies before the end of their career. That's a common issue. But when you see it work with someone like Sarah Storey, and the fact that she had the support of her husband and he would look after the baby. I remember her telling this story about training on her stationary bike and having the baby in a basket next to her. And it's sort of, you know, her child enjoyed the hum of the wheels going round, and it sent them to sleep. So yeah, this idea that mothers are an inconvenience and not as good and just, I don't know, should be shut away in the kitchen for the rest of their lives after they become redundant after giving birth is really archaic.
Women often are better at endurance and recovering quite well, and maybe enduring pain in some ways compared to certain male athletes.
And you had her with you, didn't you, in Rio?
It was the first games where I'd stayed outside of the village. And it was a really easy setup in Rio because there were so many places you could rent a flat. So I rented a flat just across the road from the velodrome. As an athlete, you have a very selfish kind of existence, but suddenly you're in charge of a small person, a small life, and it's a completely different sort of existence as an athlete mum. So I really thrived on being able to dip into my sporting career and be an athlete for those few hours a day that I was, but then to come back and have that normality of being mum, of playing on the playground, of taking her for a walk, and of doing all the things that you enjoy doing as a mum. And she was 3 years old, so she wouldn't have understood why I'd disappeared suddenly for 6 weeks.
I always talk about the emotional support that surrounds an athlete. You can have all the technical, physical support that you like, but the emotional support is what you need around you, particularly in those biggest moments, like preparing for the Olympics, but also when things don't go right. That's when it really kicks in, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm really fortunate that I've always had a really big kind of family feel around my career.
We literally are working together, you know, 24/7, apart from when we're asleep. And it doesn't work for. I don't think it would work for everyone. But I think we're both fairly logical people, and I think that helps with. And yeah, you're not completely removed from emotion. But I think it definitely helps. We understand how our minds think, which is the most important thing, and how to be logical with everything we do.
My coach, he has 2 kids, and his wife breastfed their 2 children till they were 2 years old. So when I was coming into that process, he understood what I needed, and I breastfed my children till they were ready to wean themselves. So Louisa was still feeding in Rio, Charlie's still feeding now, and he's been able to guide. He's got Barney's eyes on the ground on a day-to-day basis, and he's always able to advise from afar.
We chat now and again more from what do you think about this, more consultancy, whereas fairly early on, it was quite prescriptive. You're going to do this, you're going to work for these amount of hours at this particular power. Now it might be Sarah's thinking of doing some altitude training, and she'll say, what do you think about this? What intensity should I work at? I'm going to do some heat work before I go out to a major competition. How many days should I do? So I work with her, and maybe I'll go into the books and try and find out different methods of training to improve her.
Cycling coaching is like that. You're from a distance. My parents are just there in the background, always know what needs doing and when we need help, and that means that I'm a happier athlete. And there's one thing that my swimming coach, Colin Hood, always said. He said, a happy athlete is a fast athlete, is a successful athlete, and I think it's really very true.
Tell me about the Skoda Academy and Storey Racing.
So Barney and I set up our first women's cycling team when Louisa was 3 months old. We knew that we needed to do something a little bit differently in order to help me prepare for the next Paralympics. And so having our team meant that we had control over my race programme. And after the Games in Rio in 2016, that team didn't have enough funding and it folded. But we reinvented it in 2017 as Storey Racing. And thankfully, it's been around ever since and we've managed to make it work. And Storey Racing is an 8 to 12 rider team, depending on the availability of finance and equipment. We're trying to provide opportunities for women who are in the UK to better develop themselves within sport.
From a brand perspective, there's a real commercial point of view and opportunity. And if we don't realise that opportunity, then we're on the back foot from the get-go. But really, if we take that commercial opportunity and we take that it's 50% of the population, and we talk about that this is not just the right thing to do, it's the thing that should be done. It's, you know, it should be a given. We shouldn't even be discussing this, really, but we have to.
One of the things that really helps para-athletes is when they're treated equally to all athletes. If they have the same opportunities, the same access to opportunities, then that inclusivity helps them to thrive.
The impact that she's had, I think, has been phenomenal. I did spend a day with her in Manchester at the velodrome where she was inspiring young people, many with disability and impairment, into the velodrome, and she was absolutely focused.
So what needs to happen to help grow women's cycling, paracycling, team cycling? What is it, the visibility, sponsorship?
In cycling, in track cycling, women and men compete fairly equally. After the Games in Beijing, they rectified the fact that there was more medals available for men than women, and now it's an equal opportunity on the track. On the road, there are 2 medals as well, but there's way more men in the men's peloton at the Olympics than there are at in the women's peloton. And in the Paralympics, whilst we have equality between men and women, we don't have parity yet with able-bodied cycling. So you could say there are 2 parallel journeys, really. Women on the road are on a journey to equality with the men's pro cycling, to level up for women, to enable women to have better coverage, better sponsorship opportunities, a minimum wage, which exists for the men's peloton but not for the women's peloton. And in paracycling is a slightly behind the women's setup. We're trying to become on a par. So there's no prize money in paracycling and very few in parasport. There's very little coverage between Paralympic Games of paracycling. There's no TV coverage of our World Championships. Not one of my 38 world titles has ever been shown live on television.
Just 38.
Brands can help women in sport become more equal in terms of the press coverage and the excitement around it. There's a number of ways, but we're all in this together, right? So you can listen, but if you don't hear an effect, then maybe you're part of the problem.
So I think it's trying to provide that platform for people to promote themselves, but also to showcase what the sport's about and to provide a better opportunity for all para-athletes, and also to push forward for women to give them that parity alongside men's pro cycling.
I have absolutely loved listening to your long and illustrious career journey. You have an iron will and you are a born winner, and you are absolutely a driving force. It's been a privilege for me to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's been an honour to speak to you as well.